Hello, Saints. As you guessed it, we're going to be studying the book of Matthew. And it's not so much studying the book of Matthew as much as it is studying the author, Matthew. When I read a particular book of the Bible, I really like to get an idea of the author, the man who wrote that particular book of the Bible. I like to think about the things that this particular author brings to the table. You can't help but notice that each individual author brings his own life experiences to the table when he sits and he writes what it is he writes. Yes, the Holy Spirit speaks through the individual authors. However, what that author writes is tainted with his own individual life experiences. Many times I find that to be true. And in this particular case of Matthew, I find that to be very true. There are some things that Matthew notes that no other writer notes. There are some things that Matthew notices and Matthew writes about that none of the other disciples write about. In order to understand a little bit more about Matthew, I think it's very important to understand exactly where each one of these writers comes from. And that is what I really want to depict to you. I think too many times it's too easy for men when they first crack open the Bible and they really start digging into the New Testament and studying the Bible. It's too easy to put the disciples and to list the disciples as little stick figure men, seeing them as just plain black and white stick figure men, maybe attaching a name on them here and there. But that's just simply not the case. Each individual disciple was chosen, was handpicked for a specific reason, because each individual disciple brings his own personality to the table. Jesus knows and loves and admires and adores each individual man for his own personality and what it is he brings to the table. And I think that's why the New Testament, the Bible, well, even the Old Testament as well, is such an interesting read, because each author brings his own style, his own influence, his own life experiences. He brings that out for us to read and for us to enjoy. Without further ado, I want to tell you a little bit about Matthew. Matthew is where we're going to start. I want to tell you a little bit about Matthew and where Matthew comes from. I've downloaded Jesus of Nazareth. I've downloaded the entire movie into my computer from 1977, and I'm going to do my best to show you video clips of different scenarios. This is how I came to know the disciples. Jesus of Nazareth was a 6-hour movie, and this movie played for 2 hours a night. Obviously, it was full of commercials, and I don't know exactly when it was played, but I remember my parents sat down and everybody was watching. Everybody was watching Jesus of Nazareth. It was a very popular TV show, miniseries. The men who put that movie together did an extraordinary job of bringing out the personalities, bringing out the personality of Jesus, bringing out the personality of the disciples, bringing out the personality of everybody involved in the Bible. They did a really good job, and I know a lot of the men that I in Bible study with, a lot of the men that I meet, that I'm able to influence and minister to. These guys, they have no idea. They don't know that this existed. A lot of them have no idea that they've made movies about Jesus and about the disciples. So I'm really hoping that by watching these videos, I'm hoping that I get to shed a little light on these men and on the disciples, on the characters, to show the men that are watching these videos of mine that the disciples were real people. They were real people with real problems, with real struggles. They were working men. They were not born with a silver spoon in their mouth. Nothing came easy to them. Their life was indeed a struggle, and they were faced with many of the same dilemmas, many of the same problems, many of the same consequences that we deal with today in our life in 2020. Let's look at Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector. Matthew Levi, and here we are right here. This is probably one of the better depictions of Matthew that I've been able to find in order to understand Matthew and where Matthew comes from. The tax collectors in Israel, in Jerusalem, they were controlled by Rome. They collected taxes for Rome. And the way that whole system was set up, Rome would enact certain taxes, much like we have in the United States today. We pay taxes, and there are certain things that we pay more taxes on than others. And this was a lot the same way it was in Rome and in Roman controlled territories. So Levi Matthew was a tax collector, and Levi Matthew was not only responsible for collecting the taxes that Rome wanted, but in addition to being able to charge people the Roman tax, the tax collector, the individual tax collector, could also charge additional taxes to each individual person as he saw fit. So, in essence, the tax collector here had a tremendous amount of power. He was law, he was rule, and it was extremely easy for the tax collector to be a crook, to be a thief, to charge more money than what was actually due him or was actually due the government on a particular tax. The Roman guard, as I understand, was always on staff right behind or very near the tax collector. If you chose not to pay up, you could easily be thrown into jail, been thrown into prison, and charged a daily fee for being in prison until your full fee was paid, as I understand. A tax collector was reviled among the Jews. Everybody hated the tax collector. Much like today, nobody really likes the IRS. We tend to frown upon the IRS. Well, it was the same way 2,000 years ago in the Roman settlements. Nobody liked the tax collector, especially the Jews. And what you're going to find in the Bible, as you get to know each individual characters, you get to know each individual man. And right now, I'm looking at Matthew. Matthew and Peter have a beef. Let's just put it that way. I've noticed that there's a rivalry here. And it shows up later in Matthew's story about Jesus walking on water. And Matthew was the only author to look at this particular perspective. But Matthew, in essence, throws Peter under the bus. And it pans out in Peter's benefit. But the book of Matthew is the only book, it's the only synoptic gospel to mention something that happens to Peter. And it's definitely not an honorable thing that Peter does. And Matthew he writes about it right there. So, long after Jesus has come and gone, and Matthew, whenever he's writing his letter of Matthew to the church, he brings this up and he mentions this. But there are some other places where Matthew brings to light only things that Matthew would have access to through his influence of being a tax collector. And we're gonna study that as we jump into Matthew. But for right now, this is just kind of a brief introduction of Matthew. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about it, but this is Matthew. He's a tax collector. The tax collectors can do some underhanded dealings. They can be shady if they want to. Just know that, and know that going into the book of Matthew. But this is where I will reference any future references that I make. We'll come back here to Matthew to understand who he is and where he comes from. I want to tell you about another tax collector. Here's another tax collector. This is Zacchaeus. This is from the book of Luke. I'm fighting a head cold here, so my voice is somewhat off. But if you grew up in church at all, you'll know that there was a song about Zacchaeus. He was a wee little man was he. The Lord was passing by one day, and Zacchaeus wanted to see who the Lord was. So Zacchaeus climbed up in a tree so he could see the Lord passing by. Well, as the Lord passed by, the Lord called out to Zacchaeus and said, "Hey, come down out of here, because I'm going to your house, and I'm gonna dine with you. We're gonna talk." So this is where Jesus meets another tax collector named Zacchaeus. And it's Luke 19, Zacchaeus the tax collector. Luke 19:1. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector. He was wealthy. Luke says he was very wealthy, as most all tax collectors were. Okay, extremely wealthy. And most of these tax collectors were wealthy because they had the power of Rome behind them. He wanted to see who Jesus was. But because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead, climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and he said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed Jesus gladly. Okay? All the people saw this and began to mutter, he's gone to be the guest of a sinner. Okay? This was something else that you're going to see in a movie that I hope to be able to show, Jesus of Nazareth. The Jews did not hang out with sinners. The Jews believed that because if they kept so many rules and regulations, if they even hung out with a sinner, they would be defiled. Okay, they would be influenced by a sinner, and the poison, the evil would get into them, and they wouldn't have anything to do with sinners. And this was a tax collector, so the tax collectors really didn't have many friends. Okay, the tax collectors had to basically buy their friends, because the Jews didn't want to be around the tax collectors. Even though they were Jews themselves, they didn't want to be around them. Zacchaeus says, look, Lord, here and now, I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Now, why would Zacchaeus say that? You got to think about that. I mean, why all of a sudden would Zacchaeus feel compelled to pour himself out in front of Jesus, pour himself out in front of God, if he had not done something wrong? You know, I mean, I got to think maybe his conscience was bothering him. If he had a conscience, then I don't know, something was bothering him. Something was up. So here is another depiction of a tax collector, and what tax collectors did, what we know of tax collectors. And here again was Matthew, and we're talking about Matthew, but Zacchaeus is just an example of another tax collector. There's an example. There's a lot of money at stake here, a lot of money. Now, I've got another question. Later on, as we're deciding, as we're learning about the disciples and who controls what, here's Matthew, and he's a tax collector. Matthew is used to handling money. Okay? Matthew's a money counter. He keeps the books on people. He not only keeps the Roman books, he's going to keep his own books. He's going to keep books and books and books. He's big on numbers. Okay? He's the money collector. And I'm jumping way ahead of myself here, but I want you to think, those of you who do know the Bible, I want you to look ahead here. Of all the disciples, as Jesus and the disciples are working their way around Judea, and they're preaching and they're telling stories, okay, they keep a money purse. They take collections. They take contributions. They take gifts and offerings. They do. And there's one individual who's responsible for taking the money. This individual holds the money bag. And you can Google that and you can find that out. But I'm going to tell you right now, it's not Matthew. And that's kind of surprising to me, because Matthew's he's an ex-tax collector. Okay? If anybody should be handling the money and controlling the money, wouldn't it be an ex-tax collector? Wouldn't it? And it's not the case. He's not the one holding the money bag. He's not the one being responsible for the money bag. And this just altogether goes to show you another personality trait of one of the other disciples. Okay? This guy, probably big brute. I'm the money bag's mine. I'm controlling the money bag. And nobody's going to contest this guy that he's controlling the money bag. And I just find that kind of ironic that here Levi Matthew was an ex-tax collector, and he's not the one holding the money. He's not the one carrying the bag. So anyway, yeah, there's 17 minutes into this video, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to end this right now. And we're going to jump into the book of Matthew. Stick around, like and subscribe. Be sure to like and subscribe, please. Like and subscribe, and I also want you guys to ask questions. Please ask questions on these videos. I've got the Yahoo channel set. I've got it set to take your questions. You guys can ask questions. Ask all the questions you want. Leave your comments. Ask questions. Just don't leave anything vile. I've got it marked to censor out anything vulgar comments. But I would love to hear your comments. It just shows me that you're interacting with these videos. Thank you, and we're going to jump into Matthew.